All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get going on the next topic of this intermediate sequence, which is going to be about objectivity. So I'm David Kelly, if I haven't met you yet, and my background is in philosophy, and specifically in philosophy in epistemology, the study of knowledge, the validation of knowledge, the foundations of knowledge. And so objectivity is something that I'm deeply interested in and have written a good deal about, both theoretically. My first book was called The Evidence of the Senses, about the validity of the senses, the traditional questions about can we trust our senses as against the many skeptical arguments. I'm also the author of a logic textbook which is not an academic. I mean, it is academic. But it's for college classrooms, where my mission in writing the book is to keep the focus always on objectivity. So, although this is an intermediate course, I'm not going to give you a heavy-duty lecture in epistemology, because objectivity is a concept that all of us have and use. But it's a highly abstract one. And the different points about what it means and what is and is not objective are abstract and somewhat, at times, can get very ethereal philosophically. So I'm much more interested in laying some basic groundwork. I do want to go through the topics on the outline that you have in your binders, but I want to spend as much time as possible talking to you, asking you, raising issues that you've heard. Especially, I imagine that many of the students who are here have encountered many questions, challenges, rejections of objectivity, or the possibility of objectivity in coursework, particularly in the humanities. So, with that said, let me just give you a broad map, and then we'll plunge in and talk about some of the specific issues. Objectivity has two basic meanings and this is pretty common in philosophy. It's not just objectivism. One is what's objective is what's out there in the world. To say that something is objective means it exists in the world, not in your head. It's not an imagination. And it's opposed to what's subjective, that is, what is so to speak, in your mind, in your consciousness. So there's an object out there, like I see a car out the window. Maybe I should pick something you can see. There's a fire alarm up there, a nice red thing, easy to see. You see it, it's there, that's in the world. Your perception of it is, but in this sense of the word, subjective, because it's a part of you as the subject of knowledge grasping the object that's out there in reality. So that's one sense. The other sense of objectivity applies to the way we think and the way we function cognitively, so that we can say that someone was being objective in their thought process. Like imagine a jury. Imagine you're on a jury, and you've heard the case presented to you for and against the guilt of the accused. Now you go off and you have to think and make a decision as to what you believe is true. Okay? And in that kind of context, where someone's freedom and possibly life may depend on the conclusions you reach, I think most of us, most good people, would say, I need to be objective. I need to be convinced and go only by the facts. So in that sense, objectivity is an aspect or a virtue of thinking, as opposed to being subjective, which is just believing whatever I want, or willfully disregarding evidence, Or I'm sure we've all been in arguments where people got really defensive about their position and they started, attacking the other person with ad hominem arguments and fallacious statements and so forth. That's not functioning in an objective sense. So are we together on this so far? So here's a question. In this epistemological sense of objectivity, objectivity as a way of mental functioning and thinking, is it the same thing as being correct or being true? That is, suppose I'm on a jury and I do the best I can, but it turns out, due to whatever circumstance I wasn't aware of or body of evidence I wasn't aware of, the guy actually is innocent. I thought he was guilty, but he's innocent. Was I not being objective? Yes, sir. I'm sorry, the attempt?
The attempt to come to a factual conclusion, something that doesn't necessarily have to be a factual conclusion.
Okay, so the attempt is a key part. Yes, Gary?
Yeah, I would say objectivity is a predicate of a process, not an outcome.
Okay.
It's processes that are objective, not outcomes that are objective. The better the process, the more likely the outcomes are to be correct, but it's still the process that you're evaluating.
Okay, thank you. That's an important point. Yes, go ahead, and then I'll come back. Right. Okay, now, I think that's one piece of Gary's point also, that objectivity in this epistemological sense has to do with the process by which we reach conclusions as distinct from the product, the conclusion, and how it relates to a fact, or if it's wrong, the absence of that fact. Now, there shouldn't be too much of a divorce between these two things, because the reason we engage in the cognitive practices that we do, the logical processes that we do, is that we want to get it right. Right? Truth is the goal. So the process, the methods that we use in going through the process of thinking have to be guided by and tuned to the likelihood of arriving at truth. But the important point here, one important point here is that thinking is a process. And in that respect is unlike perception. In perception, there's a lot of processing going on between the surface of this fire alarm and your retina, and then your visual cortex, and your conscious awareness of it. But the activity that's going on is not something you are deliberately conscious of and monitoring and making happen. You open your eyes and it happens. You close your eyes, the vision's gone. Okay? But in thinking, we go through a process starting with a body of facts that we know or observe, and then we go out and observe more if we need more evidence, and then we put that together logically into to see what follows, and we draw implications. What that means, and I'm going to come back to this a little later in the outline when we talk about objective versus subjective and intrinsic. But one element of what it means is what you. Sorry, what is your name? Daniel. Is part of what this means is what Daniel said, that we always operate from a specific context of knowledge. We are not omniscient. The whole idea of omniscience is a contradiction. I mean, it would be knowledge without limit. And that context changes. As we learn, as we reach new conclusions, it grows. We gather more evidence, it grows. We see more facts, it grows. All right, now let's go back. I want to talk a little bit more about the idea of objective reality, and then come back and we'll talk more about the epistemological objectivity of our thought processes. The idea of metaphysical objectivity is that there actually is a real world there. As I quipped, it wasn't original with me. Yes, Virginia, there really is a world out there. For those of you who are not steeped in American culture, it comes from, yes, Virginia, there really is a Santa Claus. Only there isn't. So it's kind of an ironic thing. Anyway, and this is a funny thing to talk about in philosophy. I mean, I've been doing it for so long, it's natural. I'm inside the framework of the way I know philosophers sometimes think. But to most people who aren't in philosophy, the idea that you could question the existence of a world is like, what? My first book came out with a conclusion that when we see things, yeah, we see things, and the things are there. I sent a copy of the book to my dad, who's a lawyer, a very smart guy, but a very practical guy, a lawyer. And my brother later told me about a conversation. My brother studied philosophy as well. My dad said, you know, I'm proud of David, but as far as I can make out, what he's saying is that there actually are tables and chairs. I don't know how you can write a whole book about that. But if you have taken the history of philosophy, I'm sure you know. How many people have read René Descartes' Meditations or the First Principles of Philosophy? Descartes decided he was going to re-examine everything he believed and was going to start by doubting everything that he believed and thought he knew until he reached something that he could not doubt. And so he started by doubting the existence of, or the validity of his senses. Anyone remember any of the arguments? Yes. Right, it's all a dream. Because we do dream, right? And so maybe there is some evil spirit who is, when we think we have awakened from a dream state, is really just fooling us, creating that illusion in our heads. Yes?
I was just going to say, it sounds a lot like the movie The Matrix.
Yes. The Matrix is, yeah, that's a very epistemological movie. And in my view, it gets tangled in its own.
Like recursive.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a typical kind of argument. It has a more general form that we can put this way. We have had sensory perceptual experiences in the past that were not valid, that were not representative of what's really there. Dreams are one, optical illusions maybe, hallucinations, yes. And so maybe it's all like that. Maybe we're always just seeing the little movie playing inside our minds. There's a problem. There's a big logical problem with that statement. Sorry? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
We all see the same thing often.
We do, and so we can check each other's perceptions, but we've got to be careful here, because if I'm saying that I can trust my sense perception because you see the same thing, first of all, I have to be sure that I'm seeing you and that you're not a figment of my imagination, right? But also, how do I know that I ever dream?
How do you know that you are real?
That really sort of takes it all the way down, doesn't it? How do I know that I'm real? Can I answer as I? This is where Descartes gets us because, yes, if I'm even raising that question, do I exist? And you've jumped about 17 steps ahead in the meditations, but if I can even raise the question whether I exist, there has to be an I that's raising the question. Now, I would say that, so Descartes actually, and this is probably the most common position in philosophy, even now, is that I can be sure of that my consciousness exists, that my mind is there, and the experiences I have are real. The question is whether they relate to anything out there, whether it could all be just an extended hallucination, or being trapped in the matrix, or being a brain in a vat with some mad scientist, tweaking my my nervous system. But the point is, just going back to dreams for a minute, how do I know that I have dreamed? It's because I have awakened. And I look back and I said, oh, that didn't really happen. Okay? There's no horse in this room. I was having this equestrian dream, but, oh, I'm awake now. There's no horse. Or I have an optical illusion. It looks like there's a little pond out there in the distance. And it's one of the, what do they call it, the haze in the desert, the mirage. Right. Well, then, how do I know that is even possible? Because I walked there and there's no lake. And subsequently, I learned enough about light and light refraction to explain why it looked like there was, but there wasn't. So general point is the only way we can know about our own fallibility and the fact that we have made mistakes in the past is that we have found out that they were mistakes by finding out what's true. Now, the best way to this is a kind of a good context in which to refer to what Ayn Rand introduced, what objectivism considers to be the axioms, the fundamental axioms of knowledge, which are listed: existence, consciousness, and identity. What that means is there is something. What it is, what's out there, what it does, how it acts, how it relates to everything else, all of that is knowledge we have to acquire through our senses and investigation. But that there's something is a fact that we're aware of in every conscious experience. To be conscious is to be conscious of something. I know there are forms of, I don't know, not Zen meditation. There are forms of certain meditative practices that claim to reach a state of pure consciousness that's consciousness of nothing. To me, this is it's absurd. Thank you. Literally speaking, that even to be conscious, and especially to know that I'm conscious, I have to be conscious of something, even if it's an inner feeling or inner thought or a mood or the unity of all. I mean, it's got to be something that I'm aware of. And that something is there. It exists. If that something were just another state of consciousness, well, consciousness of what? Awareness of what? Maybe another state of consciousness. Maybe I'm thinking about my thinking about my thinking. But at some base level, the thinking has to be about reality. My awareness has to be about reality. And the key implication for that is what the principle known as the primacy of existence. The primacy of existence. We have what exists, and we have consciousness as the awareness of it. And the point of the primacy of existence is that what we can be conscious of is the function of consciousness is to grasp what's not in consciousness, to be primarily that's the fundamental level. And that what we can be conscious of is set by what's there. Our conscious faculties can't just, out of nothing, out of whole cloth, make up all the contents of our perception. Even when we make up stories in imagination, we're drawing on elements, like the unicorn, a horse, and a horn, that we actually have seen in the world. When we tell more advanced science fiction type stories or fantasy stories, we can imagine people flying or waving a wand and balls flying around. But we're still talking about wands, balls, and people. So the world doesn't depend on our being aware of it, but our awareness of the world does depend on there being the world there, at some level. Now, for perception, that's very easy. That's very simple to see, in principle. I mean, my dad was right about this. You open your eyes, there's the fire alarm, or there's a chair, there's a table. I have a perception of it. It's right there. And in a sense, I can't be wrong. There are ways in which I can draw the wrong conclusion if the circumstances are unusual. The lighting is poor, or like with a mirage, I'm having weird refraction circumstances. But by and large, the senses reflect the whole constellation of causes that are operating on them, including the internal causes of how our visual systems and auditory systems work. So, but when we reach the conceptual level, when we start and when we look at the uniquely, as far as we know, uniquely human capacity to group things together into objects, this chair, that chair, as opposed to this table, and so forth, and talk and form the abstract concept of a table as such, a table as a kind of thing, a chair as a kind of thing, people as a type of living thing. What we're doing is forming an abstract concept that designates a range of things, an open-ended range of things that fall within that concept, but there is no abstract. Out in the world, there's no such thing as the abstract chair that's just chair, but has no specific color, because chairs can vary in color, or that has no particular size, or no such thing as just the pure human being, containing only the human essence, the power of reasoning, but without any of the individuating features that make us different. Right? It's like there are philosophers who have held that, they are known as the intrinsicists, at least that's what we call them, who have held that whenever two or more things belong to the same kind, it's because they literally have the same essential abstract property included in their identity. So it's like, I don't know, going into a clothing store. 7 people can buy the same shirt. Okay, and the shirt's pretty much identical. And then then one person will roll up the sleeves, another person will put on jewelry, whatever, and that's the model of what it's like. The shirt is like our common human identity, or the common identity of the chair. All the accessorizing is what makes us individuals. So, but that's not what objectivism holds. Objectivism holds that, no, there are just individual things in the world, individual people, individual chairs, for that matter, individual blades of grass out there on the golf course. But we have this extraordinary capacity to recognize similarities and differences, put them together into concepts that we then express linguistically with words like grass, table, chair, human. And be able to refer to an entire set of things with one thought, one word. And this is an extraordinary capacity. Whenever it first arose in human evolution, it was, I don't know. We don't know. I've just been listening to some tapes. I don't think we know where language literally first arose, at what level, but it is certainly what has enabled concept formation, and language is certainly what's enabled human beings to expand, flourish, and engage in constant progress. Okay, now, what I'm talking about now, if you consult your outline, is this difference between perception and conception. It's part 3A, say something, see something. See something, say something. That's a little phrase that public safety officials we hear all the time. But the point is, you see, seeing is perception, but saying is conception. And for a concept to be valid, what makes concepts valid, useful, reliable, objective tools of cognition is not that there's a thing out there like the fire alarm that every concept stands for, in the way that your perception is right and valid because your perception corresponds directly to that object. We have to engage in forming our concepts by a process that takes account of the actual important similarities and differences among the things that we perceive. And so there are bad concepts. There are concepts that result from processes that were not conducted properly. Ayn Rand wrote about a number of these in the political context. I'll just mention one, extremism. The concept of extremist, which was used in American politics a good deal and is now often used in referring to radical groups in the Middle East, the jihadis. Labeling people as extremist, classifying the universe of political positions that way, is picking on a non-essential trait. It's extreme. What are you extreme about? Are you extremely for liberty? Are you extremely for an Islamic caliphate? Are you extremely for single-payer health care? Well, the differences between having liberty as your primary principle and having a religious theocracy as your primary principle, that difference is much more important than how far you take it. So that's a bad concept. It's an ill-formed concept. Can anyone else think of concepts that are just mistakes, maybe? There's some in science, well-known examples in science that are, a little more innocent because they were attempts to come up with a theory. But they're also, we see them in politics.
You're asking if there's a place in science where that has later been proven false?
That would be an example.
Fusion comes to mind.
Okay, I think that's true. I don't know. If there are anyone here still working on it, I'll take your word. But there are things that would be an example, or perpetual motion machine, or phlogiston, which is a classic example in the history of science, where it was a reasonable hypothesis at one point that there was a substance that when material burned, a substance left. Glenn, am I getting this right about phlogiston?
You can't get it right. There's no way to get it right because it's not phlogiston.
Right. Getting the history right. Okay, so what that means is that we have to be very vigilant in forming our concepts about making sure that they are accurate and reflect the essential similarities and differences out there. And it is not a trivial matter. And then when we use our concepts to identify facts, like grass is green, or this type of grass grows more rapidly in these conditions than others, or that is a fire alarm that is has a function of releasing an awful, hideous noise if it reaches a certain temperature. All of that factual knowledge comes ultimately from the way we form our concepts and what they're the observational evidence behind them. Diana. Yes, that's a classic example. Can anyone see what's wrong with that?
What was the example?
The French socialist in the 19th century said all property is theft. Anyone else? Daniel, you've had a chance.
Somebody has to own it first, right? You can steal it.
Sorry?
Somebody has to have property in order to steal it.
Right. The concept of stealing means taking someone else's property. So you can't say all property is theft, except, I think we all probably can guess what he meant metaphorically as a socialist. If the whole institution of private property is not right for human beings, we should all share. But anyway, the way it was put, it was a classic conceptual error. So what have we got so far? We have there's the reality of the world as an objective existing thing, and the reality of things in that world as objective in a metaphysical sense. And we have epistemological objectivity as a characteristic of a process that's required. Why? Why does it matter that we be objective? Yes?
Use the example, when we went to Afghanistan, we would call them terrorists, but the general actually issued an order that we had to call them insurgents. But it still raises the question, who, they never really specified. So now instead of looking at everybody as a terrorist, you're looking at the guy that's working on base as an insurgent. This is fear to you. So if you're not being objective about who you're talking about or what you're talking about, you're going to assume wrongly, group people together.
Okay, that is another typical kind of manipulation of language to avoid offending people. In the case of the terrorists, terrorism is actually a fairly difficult concept to define and precisely. But I know that it was not the theoretical concerns that animated that decision.
Oh, yeah, I was
Right.
just using that as an example.
Right. It was. And as soon as you call someone an insurgent, it puts him more in the category of a George Washington than a really, really bad, hateful guy. So, right. That's why another reason language matters. So we can get it wrong, we can distort, and probably in that case, that decision came not from people saying, what is the best, most accurate, objective characterization, but how can we use the language to either not offend people or try to draw them in some way, which is not, there are times when that may be a valid function, but it's not an exercise of objectivity. So there's deliberate distortion of language. Also the sheer fact, going back to where we started, we're fallible. We can make mistakes. That's why we need a method in the first place, and it also means we have to distinguish the process from the product. And we still have to struggle for objectivity in the way we think, even when we're not, either don't have enough evidence or think we do, but it's wrong and reach a false conclusion. Now, let me ask another question. Since we're talking about objectivity, how many people have taken or given tests and drawn a distinction between objective and non-objective exams? It's a fairly common kind of distinction. What does non-objective mean? That there's no right or wrong? But now, when you've... Okay, but look, when you turn in, let's say, an exam that it's written, it's not multiple choice or true false. It's the kind of thing that would be called non-objective. Would you be surprised if you got a teacher's comment back saying, no, this isn't right or this doesn't follow? The basic point about this, to take the educational example, the reason instructors offer these kinds of things is that a way of finding out whether you understand the material, and there are better and worse answers, right? Even if you can't provide a calculation that you got 17 out of 25 on this true-false quiz, you still expect the teacher to be objective and not, for example, mark you down because you happen to disagree with him or her. All right? It's still they're called non-objective because there's more interpretation on the part of the instructor. But that doesn't mean that interpretation should be willfully irrational or subjective or driven by whims or personal animosity, right? So objectivity is a term that I cite that as an example. I could cite many others of the ways in which people think of objectivity too concretely. Okay, that to be objective, there has to be just a definite, settled 2 + 2 = 4 kind of answer. And if it's not that, then it's all interpretation, all subjective. Not to belabor this one example too much, but when I grade papers, when I was teaching and I was grading papers, I could tell some students really didn't have a clue. I don't think they even read the material. Others had a kind of sort of an idea, but it wasn't put very precisely or clearly, and others really nailed it. So there are degrees of accuracy in that sense, or of precision. And even if I can't say this is, give a cardinal measure, that this is 70% of the absolutely correct way to do it, I can say this one's better than that. Okay? And we that's an ordinal ranking. We do that all the time. So this gets us to the last little section on objective, subjective, intrinsic. People who think of objectivity as requiring that there be a definite, specific, concrete answer, where no interpretation and no possibility of disagreement is possible, are treating the world as broken up into these facts and our minds as just getting the facts, locking onto those facts one to one, like we lock onto our senses lock onto the fire alarm when we look at it. And anything that is not amenable to that is subjective. Objectivism, as a philosophy, says that in thinking about objectivity as a virtue and a skill in the use of our minds, we have to take account that our minds function a certain way. They function by building up knowledge from perceptual bases, forming concepts, subject to errors of different kinds, subject to the interference of our non-rational biases or fears or preferences. All of this is the way our systems work. In the same way that doctors have to take account of the fact that, however, our bodies are built to survive and fight off disease, but they have to do it a certain way, and that way doesn't always work. That's why we need to stay on the ball about our health, and why we need to continually discover more and better ways to pursue our health. The mind is just like an organ. It is an organ. And in that sense, there's no difference between the way the mind, we should think of the mind, and the way we think of any other of our biological systems. Our minds function a certain way. So objectivity means, first of all, the choice, the commitment to finding out what's true. And secondly, doing so with the best skill we can bring about the proper way of using the methods to engage in the really quite complex processes of knowledge that we have. And I'll just end with this thought and open to questions. One of the sad things about so much philosophy is that people come in and they say, well, we make mistakes, so that objectivity is impossible. Or we always look at something from the context of our own individual knowledge, so objectivity is impossible. Or we have to choose what to think about or what to write about. So in journalism, so journalists are not objective. Well, look, all of these things all they're doing is saying, yes, our minds function that way. Objectivity is all the more needed in order to function in the way that our minds can. But when you reach the point of holding that the world is an illusion, or nothing can be said to be true or certain, you've reached a dead end. That can't be the case. We would not even have the concept of uncertainty, except by contrast with what we can be certain of. So don't be led down evil paths by people who pick on subjects that are tendentious or highly complicated, or the proper interpretation of complex artistic work or historical bodies of knowledge, or issues on the frontiers of science. All of us live here. We're sitting in chairs. We got here somehow. Most of us got on planes at some point, and we weren't flying in our dreams.